Hi guys, with the English paper 2 exam paper coming up just around the corner now, I thought it'd be a good idea to do a full breakdown of the paper. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a look at each and every question and we're going to go through how to approach each one. If you'd also like some extra lessons on improving your question 5, then please do check out our other videos because we have some really fantastic videos going through how to write an article as well. So paper 2, an overview. The first thing that I want to bring to your attention is that you need to be aware of what the examiner is looking for. For each question, you will get bullet points to actually help and guide your response. So you need to break down each question carefully and to help actually understand what the examiner is really looking for. So simply put them, in section B, this is often the one that people start with first, so that's why we're looking at that bit first now. You'll be writing an article. So this is the only year now that we know exactly the form of writing that you'll have to produce, and it's going to be an article, which is fantastic. You need to express your viewpoint on a specific topic or theme. Now this theme is going to be very similar to the theme that is also expressed in section A of the paper as well, so it might be worth just to go back over the exam paper as well, at least skim and scan the actual extracts that you have for section A, because it might give you some ideas about what to write about for section B. You need to use a range of language techniques to express your ideas. Now, a lot of misconceptions around writing an article. A lot of students will tell me that they just need to waffle and then that will help get them some marks, but that is simply not the case. When we say use a range of language techniques, we mean you need to use things like the forest techniques or even go massive techniques to help show that you know how to apply your actual understanding of English to your ideas and your argument. You need to write in 5 paragraphs. And finally, you need to spend 45 minutes writing your response. Remember, this question is worth half of the overall total of marks available for this paper, so it's really important that you spend enough time on this question and that you don't leave it too late in the exam. So try it. For section A, you'll answer 4 questions based on 2 texts. So straight away, this is going to make paper 2 that much more difficult than paper 1. Not only do you have one text to read, but you also have another text to read, and one that might be a little bit harder to understand because it is going to be from the 19th century. So some of the language is going to be quite difficult to comprehend. For the first question, you'll need to identify 4 correct statements. This is where you're going to think about both implicit and explicit information. There's going to be about 8 statements, and you'll need to identify which ones are correct. Now, a lot of people tend to get half marks on this question, and the simple reason for this is that a lot of the time the exam board will be very sneaky about how they phrase their responses. So you need to really read the actual text very carefully and not jump to conclusions. So always go back and double check your response. Question 2 is writing a summary. Now we're going to go and look at that in a little bit more detail in this video as well. It's one of the key areas that a lot of people struggle with, and really one of the main important things that you need to do for this paper, because it's about making a comparison between the 2 texts. Question 3. Hopefully most of you should be fairly confident when it comes to this question, because it is very simply going to be very similar to the question that you did on paper 1, question 2. So it will say, how has the writer used language to? The only difference really from this one is that instead of being worth 8 marks, as it would be on paper 1, it is in fact worth 12 marks. So with that in mind, the only difference you need to take into account is that you're going to want to write 1 extra paragraph for this question. And question 4, compare the writer's viewpoints within both texts. Now really when you think about the main areas that people are going to struggle with, we're really talking about question 2, question 4 and question 5. A lot of the time question 2 and question 4 do get a little bit confusing for people, so we will go through and explain the differences between these 2 questions. And again, question 5 is going to be very important just because there's so many marks available in this question. Now what I want you to do is I want you to think about the text that we're about to look at. You should be able to see a number of different words in the coloured boxes, and around these are some definitions as well. So you've got words like Neanderthal, pilferage, articulate and idleness. I just want you to spend a moment to have a look through for all the definitions and decide which ones match with which. If you're not too sure what they mean, don't worry about this too much because we will be going over it in a minute, but these are the typical kind of words that you're going to get in the 19th century text. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to skip ahead and I'm going to go through the answers myself. Class feedback. Check your answers against the ones below. So the first one then, Neanderthal. So this means something that's uncivilized, unintelligent, and it's normally used in quite a derogatory way or a negative way to describe a man. The second one then is pilferage, so the action of stealing something of little value. Number 3 is idleness, so being lazy and lacking motivation. And number 4 is articulate, so having or showing the ability to speak coherently. So a good thing to think about is to think about these key words and think about the connotations of them. So what do they suggest? And this might actually help give you a kind of impression about the text that we're going to look at today. Zooming in and actually breaking down keywords is going to be really important for questions 3 and also question 4. So it's a really good task to kind of have a go at and just to practice, just to hone in on your skills for those questions. Read the extract in preparation for answering question 1. So question 1 is normally going to speak about text A, and it would normally be from the first paragraph, maybe the first 1 to 12 lines at most. And what we're going to do, we're going to read it very carefully and go through it, and then there's going to be the statement on the next slide which will take you through the questions for question 1. So here's the text then. It says, being a teacher these days is an almost impossible task. Job adverts should read, seeking an intelligent, hard-working, adaptable, resilient individual who can simultaneously capture students' imaginations and squash any signs of low-level disruption. Candidates also need to be able to create lessons, mark on their own time, and know the individual needs of every learner they teach without a moment's hesitation. I often think of this during the long, arduous first weeks of September and wonder if it wouldn't have been easier to just become a Navy SEAL. I am, however, utterly terrified of the water, so I am forced to face the reality of my situation. I am a teacher, and despite the many challenges, I will keep soldiering on. Now, if you want to spend a bit more time going through the extract yourself, please feel free to do so. I'll also include a link in the description for this video where you can find the full extracts for both source A and source B, should you want to practice the full exam paper yourself. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you the different options you could have for question 1. Look again at lines 1 to 10 of source A and identify the 4 true statements. So our first statement says then, being a teacher these days is an impossible task. B, teachers have to mark outside of normal working hours. And C, she finds the first weeks of a new academic year difficult. D, it is easier to be a Navy SEAL than to be a teacher. E, teachers have to deal with many difficulties. F, the teacher struggles to make her own lessons. G, she is going to carry on teaching despite the challenges of the job. So a good thing to realise with this one is that it's not testing your ability to say whether this is a true or false statement in itself, but really whether it was something that was actually said in the extract. A good thing to do is to go back, keep checking with the text as well, and just to really think about which ones are the correct answers. If you'd like to pause the video now and go through this in your own time, please feel free to do so. I'm going to jump ahead now and start looking through the answers. Class feedback. Check your answers against the ones below. False. Almost an impossible task. So if we think back to the actual statement that was given for A, it said it was impossible to be a teacher these days, and of course it isn't. She actually says it is almost an impossible task. Now this is actually very typical of the kind of question that you would get or the type of statement you might face for question 1. And what the examiner has actually done here is to be quite tricky and use the word almost just to change the meaning of the actual sentence. If it's almost an impossible task, it means it's very difficult, but it's not impossible, but it's nearly there. B. So teachers have to mark in their own time, and again you can see there from the quotation that it's true. C. So that one was about whether they found it difficult. So true, the long arduous first weeks of September. Now this statement is really testing your ability to know what the word arduous means, and of course it's just a sophisticated word that means something hard or something difficult. D. So false. Wonder if it wouldn't have been easier to just become a Navy SEAL. So again, this is another statement that tries to catch you out there. She's not saying it would have been easier to be a Navy SEAL, but that's something that she's actually wishing or thinking about. And if anything, she's just thinking about this in kind of a funny or comical way to kind of stress or emphasize how hard she has to work as a teacher. E. True, they have to be adaptable and resilient. F is false. She doesn't struggle to make her own lessons. It doesn't state anything about her struggling to do that. And final one, G, is true. She's going to carry on being a teacher because at the end of that paragraph it says there that she's going to soldier on despite all the challenges that she faces. Now we're going to move on and we're going to take a look at question 2, and we're also going to think about not just the question but also how do we need to lay out our response as well. Question 2. Use both sources to answer the questions below. You need to refer to both source A and source B for this question. Both writers speak about students they taught, Jamie in text A and Tommy in text B. Use details from both sources to write a summary of what you understood about the differences between the two students, Jamie and Tommy. Now this question is worth 8 marks. Section A altogether adds up to 40 in total, then you have 40 for section B as well. If this question is worth 8 marks, that means we need to write 2 paragraphs, and you want to aim to write for about 10 minutes. Now if you struggle to start with that one, then that's absolutely fine. What we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and we're just going to go through the typical structure that you can use to make sure you're successful when answering question 2. So how do we structure our response? So this is a real easy way to just memorize how to structure the response. Now it doesn't matter really whether you do piece or Peter or anything like that for question 3, because for question 2 we're not really focusing on any language techniques. We're just writing a summary, so this is a typical structure you could follow. So first of all, point. Make a point about one of the students. So typically you'd start with text A just because that comes first. Give some evidence, so identify an appropriate quotation to support your point. Explain. Tell us what does that actually tell you about the learner. So if it's the student in text A, what was the point of selecting that quotation? Why is that the best quotation or one of the best quotations to actually tell us something about that person? And the final one, link. Use a discourse marker to make a comparison to text B. When we say a discourse marker, we of course mean things like however or on the other hand. You're not going to say that they've got similarities because this question is really asking you to identify the differences between these two students. And another good thing to remember is that this is only one part of the first paragraph. So once you've wrote about the student in source A, you're going to link it to this student in source B and then follow these steps again. So you would say, however, the student in source B has been described as, give a quotation, so there's your evidence there, and explain the relevance of it as well. And all of that together would just be one paragraph. So you need to think about making sure you're structuring this appropriately and making sure that you write enough. So what you see on the board is literally going to be a quarter of your response. So it needs to be kind of 4 times the length of what you can see there. Look at text A and identify any details about Jamie. So what we've got here is just a very shortened version of what you would get when you see the full text. And we're just going to go through and we're just going to see if there's anything we can identify and help us to use for question 2. So it says then, one such bittersweet experience was when I met Jamie Savage. Savage by name, savage by nature. That was the remark made by the head of the department when he was just transferred into my English class. Try as I might to expel this remark from my mind, I couldn't help but understand why my colleague had made such a statement. Standing at 6'6" at just 15 years old, Jamie stood out like a sore thumb amongst the rest of the class. He had a surly demeanour and eyes that seemed to bore into the soul of any student who tried to look his way. When the class was completing group work, he would refuse to take part, instead resorting to make doodles on the side of his work instead of completing the task. There were times where his attitude had me at my wit's end. No matter what approach I would take, he seemed to shut me down at every turn. Now, if we remember when we went through actually how to approach this question, we don't need to worry too much about any language techniques. However, is that if there is anything that you do notice or any kind of simile or metaphor or anything like that, then you can always use it when you come to attempt question 4. The ideal thing to do now is to go through and see if there's anything about Jamie that we could use in the response. The first thing that comes up is when it mentions his name. So his full name is Jamie Savage, and it says there in the quotation, savage by name, savage by nature. So that is actually a really good one to use because this is giving us an impression that this student is potentially not very well behaved, might be violent, or might be quite aggressive or something like that. That's really open to a bit of interpretation. The next thing that comes up is that it says that he is standing at 6'6" at just 15 years old. Now, if we think about that logically, that means that generally he's quite a tall student. So standing at 6'6" at just 15 years old, Jamie stood out like a sore thumb amongst the rest of the class. Now, this actually is a strange thing to point out because the first thing we said about Jamie was that he was a savage, which means he's probably going to be aggressive or quite a violent student. However, this actually makes him seem like he might be a figure of ridicule. He might look quite different and unusual compared to other people in the class, and it might actually mean that he is someone who might be bullied or pointed out for being different as well. Next thing then, he had a surly demeanour and eyes that seemed to bore into the soul of any student who tried to look his way. So a good thing to focus on here is that his eyes seem to bore into other people's, which essentially we can infer from that he is quite confrontational. Potentially he doesn't like it when other people look at him, and he tends to kind of stare back at them as well, which again might be an interesting thing to comment on for question 2. When the class was completing group work, he would refuse to take part. Okay, so we've got refuse to take part. So that's telling us that he's not someone who potentially puts in all the effort that he probably should within his lessons. So again, as we're going through this, you should be consciously aware of that you also need to be comparing this to the other character who we haven't yet looked at for source B, and think about the kind of things that might come up and how it might be perceived, because this is a modern student and in source B it's going to be the older one, so the one from the 19th century. So instead he resorts to making doodles on the side of his work instead of completing the task. There are times when his attitude had me at my wit's end. Now, if you're not sure what we mean by this, at my wit's end, it is a fairly old expression where it means that the teacher has kind of had enough. The kind of teacher that just is pushing their buttons over and over again. It's really kind of emotionally quite draining for the teacher. No matter what approach I would take, he seemed to shut me down at every turn. So quite a challenging and difficult student for the teacher to actually deal with. One interesting thing to think about though, if you look at the text as a whole, is that this teacher actually doesn't give up on Jamie. Very typical of a more modern teacher, they keep going and going and keep working with him until eventually, if you actually look at the end of the extract, Jamie does start to complete some of the work. Maybe not loads, but at least that's showing some signs of progress. Now, this is very typical of a modern teacher. They are generally of the kind of mentality that they don't give up on students, and that's probably not going to be the point of view that's reflected in the 19th century text. If you'd like more time, then please feel free to go over it yourself. We've also got the full text in the link below as well, so please do take your time to download that and actually print it off. And it'll be really good just to help you go through and to practice question 2. We're now going to go ahead and have a look at source B. So look at source B and identify any details about Tommy. One of the more deplorable things about modern education, however, are the despicable youths that are thrust upon the unsuspecting educators. One boy, Tommy Malone, has to be the worst example I have experienced. The boy's demeanour was that of a burly, confident foreman, but his mind lacks the mental substance to articulate the most basic forms of communication. When he does speak, Tommy issues a series of grunts and shrugs like a cave-dwelling Neanderthal. His errors are frequent and idiotic. He stumbles through even the most basic tasks with reading and writing. In order to correct his behaviour, I frequently place him in the corner of the room with the dunce hat, in the vague hope that this will quell his infectious stupidity. Now, hopefully now that we've gone through that, you understand how Tommy has been described and maybe start to think about how this compares to how Jamie was described in source A. If there's any words that you're not too sure about, don't worry, because again, in the full copy of this text, we'll have a key that will go through some of the more difficult forms of vocabulary. So if we look at the start, then we start thinking about anything we can use to describe Tommy. So it says, one boy, Tommy Malone, has to be the worst example I have experienced. So this here is quite telling. This tells us very, very simply that the teacher does not enjoy having to be around this character, Tommy. Now, for this question, we really want to focus on the differences. So even though this is something they've got quite in common, we need to kind of think about what are the main differences between the two boys. So it says then, the boy's demeanour was that of a burly, confident foreman, but his mind lacks the mental substance to articulate the most basic forms of communication. So this is very, very insulting here. So even though the learners might seem quite similar in some regards, the treatment by the actual teachers is very different. Essentially, this teacher is calling the learner stupid, and this is definitely something a modern teacher wouldn't do. And again, if we look back at source A, you can see that even though the character Jamie seems to be quite a difficult student, the teacher in that extract doesn't really give up on him. So that might be something to talk about when you write your summary. When he does speak, Tommy issues a series of grunts and shrugs like a cave-dwelling Neanderthal. So this was one of the key words that we looked at the start as well. So a Neanderthal then means someone who can't really communicate, someone who's essentially unevolved, and is normally a negative or derogatory term used to describe a man. Another thing to notice here is that Tommy is actually trying. Whereas Jamie seems completely resilient to actually try, Tommy is trying, even though his responses there seem to be a series of grunts and shrugs. So at least he is kind of participating maybe a little bit more than the previous student. His errors are frequent and idiotic. Again, it's being referred to in a very, very negative way, essentially being called an idiot by the teacher, which is very derogatory. He stumbles through even the most basic tasks of reading and writing. Okay, so he struggles with reading and writing. So again, he's not refusing to take part in the lesson. Seems like he's having a go. He's doing the reading and the writing, which again in the 19th century would be the vast majority of the things that they'd be looking at. But it seems that he's not really going to get the support that you'd normally get in the modern teacher. In order to correct his behaviour, I frequently place him in the corner of the room with the dunce hat. Now again, this is going to be quite a difficult thing for a lot of people to understand if you don't know it from the key, but the dunce hat is something that was placed on students' heads when they were deemed to be stupid or misbehave, and it was essentially a hat that said dunce on it, basically meant that you were stupid and you'd be placed at the front of the classroom or the corner as a place of ridicule. So he's treated quite poorly here just for the fact that he's not very good at reading and writing. And the teacher does this in the vague hope that it will quell his infectious stupidity. So what he's doing here is hoping that by humiliating the child by putting him in the corner, by making him a figure of ridicule, that it will somehow make him smarter, which of course we know isn't necessarily the case. Again, if you'd like to spend a bit more time and go through that in your own time, please feel free to do so. We're now going to look at how to actually write your own response. Look at the student response and then use it to help write your own. So the first thing we need to think about is our summary structure. So how are we going to actually put together our summary to make it effective? So first thing, we're going to make our point. So make a point about one of the students, and of course we're going to start with student A. Support your point with some evidence, so identify an appropriate quotation to support your point. Once we've done that, we're going to explain it. So what does this tell you about the learner? Why is the evidence that you've selected relevant, and how does it help support your point? And then finally, link. So use a discourse marker to make a comparison to text B. So here's our example then. In source A, Jamie has been described as an intimidating student. Standing at 6'6" at just 15 years old, Jamie stood out like a sore thumb amongst the rest of the class. This shows that Jamie is taller than the other students, which caused him to stand out in a negative way. In source B, however, Tommy has been described as, so that is where you would need to carry on the response, look back at the examples and see what you could talk about there. So now what we're going to do, we're just going to carry on the video and we're going to have a look for the other side to see how we'd write about Tommy. Look at the student response and then use this to help write your own. So now we've had a look at how to talk about the first student, which was Jamie in text A. Now we're going to think about carrying on that response so that we have a full complete paragraph. Now it's also important to remember that for this question you need to have two complete paragraphs. So that means if you do one point evidence explain on Jamie, you then link it to Tommy and do point evidence explain. All of that just counts as one paragraph, so you need to do two of those. So if we look at the other side of it, then we've still got our summary structure. It's going to stay exactly the same. And now we're going to talk about the other character in source B, which is Tommy. So in source B, Tommy is described as being unintelligent. I frequently place him in the corner of the room with a dunce hat. This shows that Tommy is singled out due to his lack of academic success. This contrasts to the student in source A, as Tommy has been singled out and ridiculed for struggling in class, whereas Jamie stands out due to his height. You can also go on and extend that just a little bit if you want to. The important thing to think about there is that we're clearly referring to both sources, we're using appropriate quotations to actually help our summary along, and that you're making appropriate links to both texts using discourse markers, and if you can, draw in a slight comparison there at the end. How does it contrast? What are the differences between the way the two students have been described? That's it for this video now. We'll be shortly uploading another video that uses the same exam paper looking at questions 3 and question 4. We've got multiple videos on here looking at question 5 as well if you'd like to check that out. If you need any additional support, then new videos will be added every single week. Alternatively, you can leave us a comment, like and subscribe, and we'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. If you still aren't finding exactly what you need, then please do check out our partner channel, Bookworm Teaching, for more lessons and guidance on all things English. Thank you ever so much for listening, guys, and please do leave us a comment if we can help in any way. All the best. Thanks.